We bought bonds because we were promised prosperity, but little did we know we paid by borrowing from the future. Every road, every war, every rescue package, financed not with gold or savings but debt, wrapped up in financial terms most people don't understand. Bonds. Let me explain. This kind of debt isn't new. The earliest records of borrowing stretch back to ancient Mesopotamia, where clay tablets recorded promises to repay grain or silver. But bonds, as we know them, emerged much later, firstly during the Renaissance in Italian city-states, and then across Europe. Governments realized they could raise vast sums from citizens and merchants, separate from just taxing them, then offering interest in return. By the 1600s, Dutch and English governments were issuing bonds to finance wars and colonial expansion. These early instruments were tradable, creating the first public debt markets. Dutch cities, provinces, and even local water boards began issuing what were called renten, or annuities. These were formal promises. If you lent the government a certain amount of money, you'd receive a fixed yearly payment for as long as the issuer existed. Some were life annuities. They paid as long as you were alive. One of the most famous examples was issued in 1648 by the Lekdijk-Bovendams Water Board, a regional authority responsible for maintaining the dikes that kept the Netherlands dry. To fund flood defenses, the board sold a perpetual bond, written on parchment, sealed with wax, and promising 5% annual interest, forever. The bond still exists today, and it's still paying interest more than 370 years later. In fact, Yale University holds one of these original 1648 bonds in its archives. Every few decades, a Yale representative travels to the Netherlands to collect the modest annual payment, now transferred in euros. But here's the underlying flaw with these bonds. People didn't expect inflation. So that bond bought for 1,000 guilders in 1648 earned 50 guilders per year. The yearly payment would equal around 1,000 euros per year in real modern spending power. That was substantial income in 1648, but now, the modern annual payment, 5 euros per year, it's lost 99% of its value. That's the underlying flaw with these bonds. Over time, bond markets grew larger than stock markets, shaping currencies, credit, and entire economies. They were meant to stabilize nations, but eventually they became the very thing nations depended on. Then came the wars. World War I and II turned bonds into both a weapon and a trap. Britain, France, and the United States couldn't afford the staggering cost of global war. Instead of raising taxes enough to pay, they turned to the public, launching massive campaigns for war bonds and victory bonds. Posters promised patriotism and profit. Citizens lined up to lend their savings to their nations, seeing it as a necessity to save the illusion of freedom. But here's the secret few understood. While ordinary people bought bonds to support the war effort, central banks quietly bought the same, not with real savings, but by printing new money. It was the perfect illusion. Public trust and propaganda on one side, monetary expansion on the other. Governments could fight wars without emptying their treasuries, by inflating the money supply. So who really profited from these bonds? Well, it gets deep, but you guessed it. The banking dynasties, the Rothschilds, J.P. Morgan, just to name a few. They made sure the government got the money they needed. They would promise to buy the bonds even if the public didn't, but they'd get them at a discount. Then they'd wrap them up in another fancy bond package and sell them to the public, profiting from the difference and securing guaranteed interest payments from the government, which of course is only backed by future taxes on its citizens. So while us ordinary slaves are taxed to oblivion, the banking dynasties are still taking fat interest payments. And this is where bonds truly ruined money. Once, cash represented value created by production and trade. Now, it represents a promise, a claim on future labor and taxes. Think about it. You only pay with $100 note because both you and the receiving person have agreed that it's worth something and will be worth the same in the future. But it won't. It's an illusion. Bonds made debt permanent. Governments roll over old bonds by issuing new ones. The debt never ends. It only grows. Central banks now manipulate interest rates to keep this mountain of debt from collapsing. When crisis hits, they don't reduce debt. They buy it, creating trillions of new dollars, pounds, or euros from nothing. This isn't free. The cost hides in inflation, rising prices, and eroding purchasing power. The value of money dies slowly, not through collapse, but through dilution. Today, the bond market is the beating heart of global finance. Governments borrow endlessly. Central banks buy the bonds to keep yields low. Pension funds and investors rely on those same yields to survive. It's a closed loop, a system that feeds itself. But every loop has limits. When interest rates rise or inflation surges, the illusion cracks. Debt becomes unbearable, and money, once trusted, begins to unravel. Although some countries are waking up, countries like Japan, who was one of the largest holders of U.S. bonds and treasuries, have quietly been selling them. They bought them for the same reasons we did. The U.S. economy was strong, and we were promised a safe store of money, earning interest. But it's gone too far. The U.S. dollar is losing real value, once backed by gold, then the petrodollar, now backed by debt, waiting to self-implode. So next time you hear a politician say, "We'll borrow and pay it back later," remember, later never comes. Because the world doesn't run on money anymore. It runs on debt. Hit the like button and press subscribe as we continue to unmask the matrix. Stay alert and buy things that have limited quantity: gold, silver, Bitcoin. You don't need to be a genius to see the cracks in the system.